The music we call jazz has been around for about 85 years, and the music that led up to it, ragtime, was in place probably 50 years before that. Jazz piano has mirrored all of the changes in this evolving period. We find as much stylistic variety in the brief but rich history of jazz piano as occurred in classical piano over the last 200 years. The artistry of each of the great jazz pianists is as distinct one from the other as are the respective keyboard manners of Bach, Chopin, and Debussy. But what the jazz people have had in common is a tradition of rhythmic improvisation and obsession with the beat. They invented ways of pushing it forward, holding it back, displacing it, layering it, even sometimes hiding it. Jazz was originally a dance music, and in almost all jazz, the beat needs to be compelling enough to get a normal foot to tapping. The rhythm, the tradition of improvisation, and the melodic vocabulary, all of which have largely come from African American culture, these are what have made jazz and jazz piano. This is a piece called Pasquinade, a caprice by Louis Moreau Gottschalk, a New Orleans composer and concert pianist, who wrote it in 1862 when he had absorbed from black people in New Orleans the rhythms of black folk music. He had absorbed some of the elementary things at any rate, and in the next section of the piece, which I'm going to play for you, listen to this syncopation. That's the syncopation right there, this here. This became characteristic of a dance called the cakewalk, which by the early 1890s had become something that everybody was doing, white people as well as black people. And it produced a number of popular songs which incorporated that same rhythm. Here's one called At a Georgia Camp Meeting from the 1890s. This is, as I said before, sort of elementary syncopation, and it took another few years before people in Scott Joplin's generation were doubling the syncopation at the level of the eighth note so that it sounded more like this. Maple Leaf was published at the end of 1899, so we have a span that goes back to 1862 with Pasquinade, and 30 years later the Cakewalks, which became popular in the 1890s, and then maybe 10 years after that the efforts of Joplin and the other ragtime piano players to make it even more complex. This is a piece by Jelly Roll Morton, Ferdinand Lamont Jelly Roll Morton, from sometime pre-World War I. The Pearls is the name of it. And it's interesting because Jelly Roll is still playing ragtime, but he's being very inventive with it, and he's doing a number of interesting things. And my take on his piano playing is that he was paraphrasing other instruments. I think he was playing the piano like trumpet, clarinet, trombone, tuba, and so forth in the marching bands, which he must have been completely familiar with, even though when he played piano in a bordello, which was his basic occupation, he was all by himself, with the girls, of course, for playing a solo piano. The marching band played more for parades than for other purposes, and legend has it that they were frequently on display all over New Orleans. Now let's take the second part of Jelly Roll Morton's The Pearls and listen for the individual lines. Here's a trombone line coming up. Watch this. Left hand. Now let's say that that the trumpet has the basic melody and the trombone has these accompaniments. Trumpet break. Clarinet. Clarinet playing those trills. And then you come into one of the great things in Morton's repertoire. I think he's playing a tuba down here at the bottom in this third part of The Pearls, where he goes, and it goes all by itself. Of course, we figure that the rest of the band has drifted in by this time, but the tuba is still doing its relentless. And this particular harmony line of Morton's is something that eluded my ear for some time. It's just a marvelous, eccentric thing. Anyhow, he's got all the instruments going, and he's got the tuba down here, a trombone when he has time to leave the tuba alone, a trumpet and a clarinet. Sometimes he stopped doing the ragtime bass and he did some special things involving sixths with the left hand. And being from New Orleans, Morton, of course, inherited the characteristic New Orleans tradition of often drifting into tango or habanera figures. He might have played on any given night. Perhaps he played the Pearls like this, using that habanera left hand. Boogie Woogie is piano blues, and the blues is the oldest element in what we now call jazz. It goes back, we don't know how far, but undoubtedly to the first vocalizings of black people in this country. When Boogie Woogie is played, the most impressive feature of it is the steady left hand figure. They can be various. The one that I like to use is this. But when Pinetop Smith played it in the 1920s, he sounded like this. basses too. People like Pete Johnson, Albert Ammons, they did this kind of thing. Sometimes they straightened it out and played 8 to the bar rather than the dotted 8th 16th, which I've just been doing, and that would come out. Sometimes the bass took on a slightly tango or a Latin feel, like this. This was the contribution of New Orleans pianists closer up to the present, people like Professor Longhair, Fats Domino. And of course this particular feature was just about played to death in the early days of rock and roll and what was called rhythm and blues before that. Usually you'd hear a baritone sax pumping away on that figure underneath everything else. Then there was Jimmy Yancey, who did this version. And what was the right hand doing in all this? I think his right hand is trying to sing blues with all the quavering and the jumping from point to point and the vocal syllables which you can only present on piano in a funny sliding way. Very often the boogie woogie bass gave the impression of a train in its steadiness, in its deliberate, unvarying tempo. Here's a blues called Honky Tonk Train Blues by Meade Lux Lewis, which is pretty dramatic. I think you can see a train heading across the horizon quite clearly. What we have here is the second strain, or the second part, of the famous Maple Leaf Rag, which was printed as far back as 1899 and constituted, ragtime that is, constituted the popular piano music of the time. It evolved fairly quickly, however, into something else called stride piano. And the interesting thing about stride piano is the way the bass changed. What you had originally was just what piano players called an pa bass. Pa, pa. Stride people got a lot more playful with it and a lot more interested in technical challenges, so that instead of going from here to here, it would perhaps go from down here to there. And they began to work separate melodies out in the bottom of it, which were usually played by the fifth finger, so that you'd have a separate melody. All the while, the answering chords would be like this. And it wouldn't necessarily be only the downbeat of the bar, it could be a couple of other places. Could be in octaves too. could be in tenths later on, when the gentleman named Fats Waller began to fool with it. Okay, what was the right hand doing? The right hand would, the Joplin, original Joplin piece was pretty swinging in its own way, but they loosened it up so that it was more of a triplet rhythm instead of, it came out. And then after a while, the way piano players are, they changed it. These people were very inventive, and they had to play for many, many hours every night. And pretty soon they evolved different figures so that Maple Leaf Rag might have come out sounding like this. And then this is the nature of jazz. The original melody was long cast aside, except maybe referred to now and then. But the piano player would do as many virtuosic and entertaining things as possible with both hands. And pretty soon, this constituted a separate form of jazz piano playing. The form of the original piano solos were, like ragtime was, based on marches. And then the same elements could be applied to almost any pop tune. And it should be remembered that in those days, I doubt very much whether the players, James P. Johnson, Willie The Lion Smith, and Fats Waller, referred to it as stride. I think that term came a little bit later on. It was just called ragtime, and that's the hip way of playing ragtime in the early 1920s, in New York in particular. Other players perhaps were in Baltimore and other northeast cities, but as far as we know, the three people I mentioned were New Yorkers, and they played endlessly and with tremendous invention night after night in Harlem, in New York. This is Earl Hines' trumpet style of piano playing, which he introduced in the 1920s when he was working with Louis Armstrong. Obviously he was influenced by Armstrong. Possibly Armstrong was influenced by him, and at any rate they shared a common style in which Hines seemed to be trying to play trumpet licks on the piano. This is not as easy as it sounds, because you can't do certain attacks and quavers on the piano that you can with a wind instrument. So when Armstrong would do something which would be on the piano, the best you can do, the quaver would be done as a tremolo. And this trumpet attack. Another thing that Hines did, he no longer felt that it was necessary to play the neatly laid out regular stride bass of the people like, say, James P. Johnson. He broke it up. He suspended the rhythm with runs, technical flourishes which anticipated Art Tatum, like of course he was, and you should be, counting all the time he did these things, so that because they come out right. They're not just cadenzas in 1, 2, 3, 4. All Also, he anticipated the regularities with syncopation. Of course, individual piano styles evolve over time, and pianists don't play exactly the same way throughout their careers, far from it. But we are focusing now on Hines of the 1920s, and I think it's fair to say that Hines of the 1920s was in a progression following Jelly Roll Morton. Hines might not be flattered by that comparison, but in that they were both influenced by other instruments in the way they played the piano. The pianist who followed Hines in many ways was Teddy Wilson. Teddy, instead of playing like a trumpet, in my judgment, was playing more like a clarinet. Monophonic for the most part, less chordal, more linear, more classical, dynamically calmer than Hines' excited manner, maybe you might say more Mozartian. And all of this led him to be playing in a very compatible way with the style of Benny Goodman. And of course we know that Teddy Wilson and Benny Goodman were great musical partners in the 30s and 40s and even 50s. From Hines, it seems, Teddy Wilson adopted the walking 10th bass, but he kind of restored the evenness to the left hand. He played a modified stride way sometimes, in which instead of the full stride that would have been full stride. Teddy did this in tenths. Only 3 notes were necessary. My own terminology is that I don't think it's fair to call either Earl Hines or Teddy Wilson stride pianists. I would rather define stride more narrowly as the full solo piano way that James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, and Willie the Lion, and some others played. And I think that Wilson and Hines were something else. This is the historical function of the piano in a rhythm section, in a dance band, in a show band, in a polka band, in the early days of jazz kind of band. Umpa, pure and simple. The left hand would be doubling with a tuba or a bass player. Right hand would be doubling with a banjo. The drummer would be going through with what drummers do. Sometimes in the 1920s, the pianist, for a tempo slower than this, would be playing this sort of thing. 4/4 in the right hand, 2 in the left. That's the way they were actually published in some of the old dance band arrangements of that time. But of course, jazz suggests that things be loosened up and that individual players be given opportunities to change things around. So the pianist very often would perhaps keep this stuff going with the left hand with the rhythm section, but in the right hand put in some doodles. Very much like he would do if he were playing solo piano altogether. But you have the option of dropping out and returning to the rhythm section, maybe doing the doodles for points of heightened excitement. Then the pianist might not play in rhythm all the time. He might do tenor melodies. Say the horn was playing, and by the way, the name of this tune is Indiana. All in the interests of keeping the thing going and building up the excitement in an ensemble. All the horns playing together contrapuntally, the pianist doing his bit. The bass player would play along very often in 2-beat in the early days, and then walking around in 4. He might or might not always be coinciding correctly with the pianist's left hand. In those days, bass players were playing acoustically, couldn't hear them anyhow. And since the recordings weren't of much higher technology either, the entire band would drop out for the piano solo. Suppose an arrangement goes piano only. And everybody would come back in again after 16 or 32 bars. Old records actually were made that way. The great break happened when Count Basie and the swing rhythm section appeared on the scene in the early 1930s. The piano no longer needed to dominate. The bass player would be walking on the bottom, the guitar would be playing with him. The drummer would be doing his Joe Jones thing, kind of thing like that. Basie would be doing, if you hear him without the rhythm section, it's surprisingly minimalist. Still, he might do a tenor melody. Remember, everybody's swinging underneath the pianist, who is essentially decorating, except for moments when he might join in the rhythm section to really get things pushed, like with an extra beat like that. Also a swing thing, but it's doubtful whether he'll keep this up for too long. Mostly like maybe. Now, in the bebop period, we had yet another revolution. First of all, the time was always 4/4. And the piano, the guitar was largely omitted from the first bebop rhythm sections. It's come back in, but sometimes a little uncertainly. You're not quite sure, and he's not quite sure of his function, in my opinion. Anyhow, the pianist would comp, which is a term that means he would drop in accents here and there, out of time and usually off the beat. Let's go back to Indiana. We'll put it in Charlie Parker's key in A flat. And the pianist, do 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 do, do 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 boom. 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, even that began to be a little bit too lush in harmony, because bebop pianists tended to strip it down to fewer notes. And you may ask, well, how does he know where to put all those accents if they're so arbitrary? Well, very often, if it's a good pianist and he's experienced with what the soloist is doing behind whom he's comping, he'll simply watch and see where the breath is. If the player goes, he's going to breathe somewhere. You try to put in a beat there, if possible. no major sin if you don't get it quite right, but around that time, around that point in the progression of the horn player who's being accompanied. You want to hit where the chord, where the harmony really changes for an important thing. But you can lay out a lot of it. You can lay out a couple of bars. Maybe the drummer's putting in various bombs and things. And the harmony itself was changing. It was no longer this, no longer that nice circle of fifths kind of harmony. The boppers went this way. Chromatic harmony rather than around the circle. And the bebop function of a piano player in the rhythm section is essentially what we still do even now, unless you're playing older kind of jazz, obviously. But it became the standard of rhythm section players, and that still goes on today, even though there may be other things that are required in any given performance. Many people think that Art Tatum was the greatest jazz pianist, and in terms of technique, there's no question about that. In terms of harmonic invention, he was way ahead of anybody in his time. Of course, harmonic invention has gone in several different directions since those days. Tatum played extremely fast when he chose to. He played with tremendous velocity, and as a result, people simply couldn't comprehend what he was doing. What might be useful for us is to put Art Tatum into slow motion, slow him down and figure out exactly what he was up to. Because what he really did was to use a certain vocabulary. He recycled patterns from time to time and tended to redo certain harmonic progressions in the same way from song to song. Let me show you some of these devices out of the Art Tatum vocabulary. For example, here's what I would call a G-turn device that Tatum used, which works on the tones in a G7 chord. Or let's make it a G13 chord like this. Very slowly. Notice it's the same fingering all the way up. 4, 3, 2, 1. Then that pivots up to the next one. 4, 3, 2, 1. It's not difficult to do, and it's possible to do it very fast. And there's another variation of that which you can do with only 3 notes instead of 4. You can go like this. 4, 2, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2, 1, 4, 2, 1. And that comes out like... Now here's how both Tatum and Teddy Wilson used a descending pentatonic scale. Art Tatum frequently used a descending pentatonic scale. Teddy Wilson used the same device, and it sounds like this. It can be used over a plain chord or a passing chord like that. But it is very useful, and it gives an impression of tremendous speed. If we slow it down, the fingering is a little bit odd, because once you get past the introductory 5, you are into a series of 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. Oddly enough, this kind of run feels better if you do it more rapidly. In G, in F, and of course you can convert it into something slightly different as you're moving along. Now this sort of pentatonics, of course, is not at all like McCoy Tyner or Chick Corea might have done. It was not the John Coltrane school of pentatonics, which was more this sort of thing. And yet it is kind of the same materials. Very useful device. Tatum sometimes embellished the beginning of this pentatonic descending passage with a little flourish at the top, like this. Like so. Tatum would play this descending pentatonic passage in different keys, of course, but also in different places in the time. He'd start on the first beat, the second beat, the third beat. Also, sometimes he would put a little flourish at the beginning of it, a chromatic 2 or 3 notes as a flourish just to begin it, like. So I'll play it and I'll displace it, different beats of the bar, and I'll put this flourish on it, and I'll do this one in B flat. Now I'd like to show you some neighbor tone devices that work in D flat. This is a device that uses the tonality of D flat. So let's put down the D flat here and hold on to that, and this is what it sounds like. Once again. You'll notice that your thumb is always on the white keys, going up a diatonic scale. And in your right hand, you are almost playing a scale in thirds, like so. You could displace it a little bit, and it sounds like. But the nice thing about this is that it's easy to do very fast, like this. And you can also do it descending. Right? I'm playing a D flat scale, and then I'm going to whatever is convenient, a third below it. The melody is always on my 4th finger in this descending mode. Now, this suggests that you can go farther with it and put the thirds together so that it comes out like this. The thumb is always on the white keys, so you're dealing with, but it's preceded by the thumb on the white key closest to it, like so. Again, the wonderful use of this thing is that it can be done very fast. Tatum especially would dazzle people with this one, the descending one, like. But well, that's what it is. Here are some diatonic devices that work very easily in the key of C. Here's a diatonic device. Naturally, it centers around the C scale. You don't have to play a black note at all in this thing, and what you do sounds like this. Let's slow it down. Starting on the B in the C scale, it's a step and a third. half step, a third, whole step and a third, whole step and a third, half step and a third. And coming down, it's the same kind of action. You could also do it with an A minor chord. You could do it on an F. And if you wanted to, you could convert it into a leading tone and a third like this. In other words, the 2 and the 4 always play a diatonic scale up. The thumb always leads them into it. Coming down, the thumb jumps to the next lower position. These things are very simple when you take them apart, but at the Tatum-esque velocity, they're very useful and very impressive. Here's another little device, a diatonic, but really based on pentatonic. You go like this. I'm using a chromatic device, and I'm starting on the D, and then I'm going down here, then I'm jumping up to here, around this black note, then around this black note, then around this one, then around this one here, around the D flat, around the E flat, around the G flat, around the A flat, around the B flat. So, and if I do it around every black note, it comes out. However, I can make it so that it eliminates the 4 of the scale, so it can be used more as a plain C chord, and it'll come out like, skip this one and go up here. Coming down would be something like this. And here's a little slight variation on that Teddy Wilson and Mel Powell did. They went but basically it is diatonic and a piece of cake. Then there are sextuplet devices, which can be used in all keys. The things we've gone into so far in all of these runs have been in either triplets or in 8th notes or in 16th notes, but there's a whole bunch of them that work very well in sextuplets, 6 to a beat. And one of them, for example, sounds like this. Let's slow it down. The 5th one, the 5 on the first note is really not essential. It just gets you started. Here's where it starts. Let me tell you the fingering. 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 1. So, or. Now that was for the F chord, but here's one you can use for a B flat chord. It's not quite the same because for convenience sake, you're really doubling back and forth between an F9 chord and an F minor 7 chord. Watch. These runs, you see, are based more on what's convenient for the hand than they are on some exact musical idea. It's what the hand can do and what's easy for velocity. Here is one, here's another one, and this one I will put into E flat. And that is very much like what I did before in 16ths, but if you do it in sextuplets, it has a wonderful rhythmic vitality. You could start it up here. You can start it here. And in slow motion, that would come out like this. And it's the same fingering that I illustrated before. Here's where it starts. Say it starts on the B flat 3, 2 on the G, 1 on the F, 3 on the E flat, 1 on the C, and so forth. Or you might use your 4 on the B flat instead of the 3. Or back and forth. Now here is one in A flat, which is almost a complete A flat diatonic scale, but you leave out one tone and it becomes a sextuplet. So very good for a rhythmic purpose. A little faster would be the ideal way to do it. Now, here's something else. If you take your ordinary minor scale, which includes the lowered 9, it would come out for a D7 chord, it would come out like this. It doesn't settle on it doesn't resolve for several octaves, but that makes it even more dramatic. In slow motion, that would be like so. And this is of course one of the minors that you find if you practice all your minor scales. That sort of thing. What Tatum does sometimes, he takes his sextuplets and he converts them into quintuplets, that is, groups of 6 notes to groups of 5 notes. Instead of doing that, he'll put these 2 notes together. So he's got a group of 5 notes because he's jammed the D and the E flat together. Again, if you do it fast, which was to begin with, and it's become. There are a great many different uses for broken arpeggio devices like this one. If you take simple arpeggios, you can often convert them into fairly dazzling runs, as Tatum did. I mean, for example, if you make an arpeggio out of the simplest thing, triad system like that, that's pretty good if you do it. If you do it and open it up so that it's a broken sort of arpeggio like this, I think it's even better. And that comes out. And you can do this in almost every key, even the keys where the thumb strikes the first note. In B flat, say, here's the thumb down here on the B flat, second on the D, then jump up to the top of the octave with the 5th finger, then thumb again. You could do it in G flat. These things do not have to have a static chord underneath them. it can frequently be the sort of device where you are playing this in the right hand, but the left hand is moving around in a diatonic or even a chromatic way. You can even do this. Suppose you say a B flat chord, a B flat 7 in the left hand, then this same thing becomes a harmonic extension of that, like. So you're really dealing with this advanced chord using the same old C arpeggio. Suppose you struck a G flat chord in the left hand, use the C arpeggio again. That's pretty good there, right? Almost anything will work in that way. Suppose you have an E flat chord in the left hand, an A in the right hand, giving you a tritone relationship. So it's clear that some patterns work best in one key and some work best in another key. What Tatum did that was brilliant was that he would play tunes in difficult keys like B, but he would throw in easy runs from, say, C, making a harmonically fresh and intriguing and exciting result. Let me show you. If he were playing in the key of B, and he often did, you would wonder how he would use the very natural C7 or C9 run. And this is how it would be. If you're resolving in the key of B, you do it basically from an F sharp 7 to the B. Now, if you take the F sharp 7 and put a C chord on top of it, then what happens is this. It's this one. It's the C7, literally a ninth run, but put the C7 over the F sharp and you have up to speed is, or another version of it. And what you have there is technically an F sharp 7 chord with a flatted 5 and a flatted 9. Okay, so that's one device. Now, suppose he were playing in the key of E. Or suppose he had just landed on an E chord in some other context. Same principle. Left hand will play the E. Suppose the right hand plays a G chord. Very nice chord. Right out of George Gershwin. Suppose you run up on the G chord while holding the E chord in the left hand. Or this one. And then what you have is an E7 with a raised 9. And if you felt really fancy about it, you could do this chord, the E in the left hand and a B flat in the right hand. And then you would have an E7 with a flat 5 and a flat 9. And take your B flat devices and all these things are possible on a simple E chord. And finally, I'd like to show you this. In the key of F sharp, a cadence would resolve to G sharp 7, G sharp minor 7, C sharp 7 to F sharp. Well, in this case, why not stick in an F7 lower neighbor before you find the resolve, so that you'd have. That's G sharp minor 7, C sharp 7, F to F sharp. And if you're doing the F, you can do a run on an F chord, and the result is. Which is, again, this in slow motion. Resolving. Or other varieties of F7 chord. or the point is that it's going somewhere unexpected. It's going to go to the F sharp. So all of these things Tatum learned to do, and the principle is that he would take runs in one context and put them in very odd keys to get a whole different use from them. This is not to say that Tatum was anything at all like painting by the numbers. On the contrary, he was full of surprises. First of all, he was fluent in all the keys, and he would begin one pattern and convert it into another, in midair, so to speak. He might start with one of the patterns I've been discussing and then suddenly go into a relative minor scale, a chromatic scale, and end up somewhere else. You never knew what he was going to do, and this is why he was so brilliant. Well, here's how it would sound if you put them all together. I'll just try to lay in all the Tatumisms I can get away with, and I think we'll do it on the old song Body and Soul. Body and Soul is particularly well suited to this sort of demonstration because it's basically in D flat, and then it goes to D natural and stops off in C, and a lot of these runs are made to order for those kind of chords. So here is Body and Soul. You might wonder why we have a copy of Tchaikovsky in front of us when we're about to talk about the piano playing of Erroll Garner. There is a link, though, and as is much of Garner's piano playing, it's a kind of a humorous link. First of all, here's a piece by Tchaikovsky, written in the 1870s, more or less, and it's called Song Without Words. And the original goes like this. That is a pretty ditzy, sentimental melody to be trying to attract Erroll Garner with, but I think he would have seen the possibilities of it because he had a great penchant for taking unexpected material and making it swing. I think the first thing he might have done would be to put it in 4/4 time, and then I think the second thing he might have wanted to do would be to play it in a different key, a key with more flats in it, because his style kind of demanded that you grab a hold of those black keys, and then it might have come out something like this, for example. Okay, so what's he doing here? Well, very often he's playing the right hand in octaves with some 2 or 3 notes filled in, and it comes out rather like a brass section up in that range. This is a kind of a block chord playing, but it's in one hand, because Garner's most typical characteristic in rhythmic numbers like this is that he's strumming with the left hand in the manner of a guitar. And this pervades a great deal of the actions of his left hand. But you have to understand that when he's doing this kind of strumming in the left hand, usually he had a bass player who was walking underneath like this. He also would play little introductory accents in the right hand strumming. So what I do when I play Garner as a solo without a bass is I try to suggest the bass down there with a few notes, and I put the whole thing in this range, and I don't do it quite as explicitly, but the message is. Now, remember we said that in the right hand he'd be liable to be playing in octaves or filled octaves. He also had a different way, and it was almost the way an arranger would assign a soloist to step up to the microphone and say, play a tenor sax chorus. Say the whole band would be playing tenor sax. And then back to the big band sound after that. Another characteristic of Garner was that he used rubato, which means literally in Italian robbed. That is, you take a little bit of one beat and put it on the next one, and in effect, in piano playing, it's having the right hand play a little behind the left hand, like so. Garner would use that for a while, and then he'd suddenly break into exactly on the beat playing, and it was a very, very refreshing change. Then back to the off the beat, on. So those are the 3 things that I'd like to bring to your attention about Garner's playing. That and one other little trick that he often did. He slid from the black note to a white note in octaves. Sometimes his grace notes of this sort would even go, say, from an E flat through an E to an F. Not quite sure how he did that or how I do it, but that's the impression. Even grace notes of black to black. And put them all together, and this is what I think Garner might have done in his humorous way if he had been, if it had been suggested to him that there was a piece called Song Without Words by Tchaikovsky, and that there was a possibility of swinging it, like so. He would start with one of his elaborate, deceptive introductions. This is bebop piano. The emphasis here is almost entirely in the right hand. You can do a very good bebop piano without playing left hand at all. In which case you're just doing what the horns do. And horns obviously are limited to one note at a time. And so in the main is bebop solo piano style of the classic variety introduced by Bud Powell. You have to understand that it wasn't only Powell that began to play like Charlie Parker. It was everybody. Well, everybody except some people who resisted and who were known in the jazz press of the day as the Moldy Figs. The Moldy Figs were the Dixielanders and so forth. It was a time of great competition and more than that, of great schism in the jazz camp. It's been mostly cleared up since then, one way or another. But the beboppers took Charlie Parker's alto saxophone style and Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet contributions, and they codified the whole thing on every instrument in the orchestra. So that you had bebop trombone players, piano players, tenor sax players, and so forth. Now, what the left hand would do while the right hand was playing this, all the new vocabulary, was a lot less. It wasn't exactly setting up the harmony to be played. It was kind of just putting accents in now and then, and with not very many notes, very often just a seventh, a fifth. Sometimes they settled on a drone bass that was very much like a bagpipe. It was kind of humorous to make that analogy. But for the most part, it was just in between phrases or at important harmonic cadences. Now listen to the left hand alone while I play the same song, Indiana. The harmonies of bebop suggested that these tenths or fifths be treated chromatically rather than it was a chromatic thing. Well, all in all, this became the standard form of rhythm section playing and a very important part of jazz piano solo playing ever since. Powell himself wasn't much interested, in my judgment, in sonority at the keyboard. It took George Shearing to bring this to the style, so that Shearing's wonderfully lush, many-noted chords were sometimes applied directly to bebop lines like. And of course, with Oscar Peterson, he interspersed the bebop lines with Tatumism, with with his marvelous expanded technique. Bebop piano is very, very much still with us. Barry Harris recreates the authentic Powell style. The younger Benny Green plays a more generic but extremely valid bebop style. And we all use it when the playing moves in that direction. And some of us do it most of the time. Shearing, of course, Lullaby of Birdland, of course. The style, the technique really, is what is called block chords, and it is something that was used earlier than when George adopted it, invented apparently by Milt Buckner. George did a lot with it that hadn't been done by Buckner, but the principle is this, to get right down to it. You take the melody, you play it in octaves, each hand, and you put in only 3 notes in between. Your left hand plays the melody there, but sometimes you can redistribute the notes. You might want to do 2 notes in the left hand like this, or only 1 in the left hand like this, in which case, of course, the right hand has to jump around a bit more. At any rate, you fill them in according to what the chords are and to the nice passing voice leading that fits. George is a master of, I think more than anybody else, is the touch on the piano. This is something almost entirely non-verbal and indescribable, but when George plays any piano, you know that he is communing with the soul of the piano in terms of touch. Pianists play with different forms of touch, obviously, and nor does George always play with this delicate approach. But as opposed to, say, Bud Powell or Garner, who has a range, as a matter of fact, but could be as loud as this, or a softer, kind of a stiff-fingered manner. George is delicate, can be loud, but is always beautifully progressing from one tone to another, beautifully legato. And I think this is because George is very knowledgeable in all kinds of piano playing, from Bach to Impressionism to Romantic piano literature. He includes a lot of the classical techniques in his own playing. When George plays the famous block chord style, he discovered in his quintet that if he doubled the lower note with a guitar and the top note with a vibraphone, it came out with a gorgeous shimmering sound, if you can just imagine that. Now hear the vibraphone, and hear the guitar down here with the piano filling in the other 3 notes. Which brings us to a discussion, I think, about different types of block chords and how they resemble certain sections of an orchestra. For example, if you have 5 notes in the ordinary chord like this, you would use the same technique if you were writing for a saxophone section. Alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone. Again, the top saxophone and the bottom one, as in the piano block chord, would be doubling. Can you hear it? That's a saxophone section. Sometimes you do what some people call drop two, that is to say the bottom saxophone is a tenth lower than the top saxophone, and you don't even need 5 of them. You can get a very good sound with only 4 saxes if you do, right? Now, when you're writing for a big band, it's very analogous to what you would do in this kind of piano playing. Saxophone section, for example, might be the left hand. Brass section might be the right hand. Say you have, well, you'd have more than just 5 brass players quite often, but and they would double with a saxophone sometimes. Well, let's ignore that. Let's just say we have 5. Suppose we have 3 trumpets and 1 trombone for now, okay? So they wouldn't always be doing precisely the same thing. Sometimes you'd open them up so the saxes would have this, the brass would have this. But the orchestral style that George has and that Errol Garner has is very like what you would write for in a big band. Sometimes you might have the 2 sections diverge, as the hands might in this sort of passage, where they go in opposite directions. Sometimes you open up the voicing very wide, as you would in the left hand, and write everything else up here. Suppose you had 3 trombones, and then a brass section and saxes up here. And this doesn't begin to talk about how you double the saxophones with the trombones, but that's getting into orchestration. My point really is that this kind of piano sound is very much related to a good orchestral voicing for saxophones and brass, and actually for strings too, but that's yet another orchestration lesson. But in all of this, George Shearing, I think, has the most lustrous, marvelous sound on the keyboard, and I think, as I like to say, has made friends with the keyboard closer than anybody else I know. Let's talk about something called block chords, or block chording, which is a technique of piano playing that involves both hands in something that comes out very legato and smooth. I'll show you. Let's see how we would harmonize an ordinary C diatonic scale, a white note scale, in block chords. The original scale would be, and the result might be, okay, how did we get that? Well, first of all, we added an octave underneath in the other hand. And then, in the right hand, we put 3 notes, the 6th, the 5th, and the 3rd. So that gives us the harmonization for the first note. Then on the D, we went into a diminished chord, and so forth. Here's an F minor chord, but it didn't have to be. We could have gone, in fact, there are quite a few different variations of chords. You could harmonize this diatonic scale as differently as this. You have your choice, and it's fun to experiment with the exact tones in your chords. Now, if I were to take a melody that was written by Alexander Borodin in the 1800s it's a very familiar one. I'm sure you'll recognize it from some of its later uses, but originally it's by Borodin and it's from the Polovetzian dances, and it works very well for block chord styles. I'm going to play the bottom two parts of each harmonization in the left hand and the top three in the right hand, because it's a little more convenient that way. Recognize it? Now, I could do this too. I could then, instead of doing it in octaves, I could put the bottom note down 2 notes. Sometimes we call this drop 2, and the harmonization then becomes in practice, you mix them up. You go back and forth. And the interesting thing about this sound, which by the way works on the piano at its best down here, it doesn't work so well from here, but it has a resonance down here. Now, if you were orchestrating this for a sax section, it would be the most convenient thing simply to have the top saxophone on an alto, next one on an alto, this one on a tenor sax, this one on another tenor, and this one on the baritone, doubling the top. Which kind of sounds like Glenn Miller, if you think about it. And sometimes you might have something other than saxophones and include some clarinets, but we needn't get into the orchestration now. Basically, this is how you take the block chord style of piano playing and use it for an orchestration for a sax section. And there are other applications too in making arrangements for big bands. Then there's the matter of changing the melody so it swings a little more. Suppose I did this. Some of the things Bill Evans was apt to do when he played came from the harmony of Debussy and Ravel. Bill would very often play rootless tops of chords, sometimes based on fourths, sometimes just the convenient top of the chord. For example, here's the chord and here's what you're missing. It's true Bill would ordinarily have a bass player playing that, but nevertheless a sort of plaintive quality from the piano part emerges because his harmony seems to float in the air, unanchored. Again, this is like the Impressionist people that I mentioned, Debussy and Ravel. His harmonies were extremely influential, and so was his approach to melody. Let's stay with the harmonies for just a minute. He would reharmonize standard songs, show tunes, pop tunes, and he would do strange things with them, and they were not just for strangeness, not just sensationalism, they were just marvelously integrated in the nature of the song. For example, this old song, Poor Butterfly, originally goes... Bill might have done it this way. I never heard him do this exactly, but he might have done... Let's say it was this. So watch this. And furthermore, I'm going to put this into 3/4 time because a lot of Bill's playing happened to be on waltzes, which he invented or adapted. And if you take Poor Butterfly in 3/4 time using these chords, you have something like this. A B flat minor, G flat major 7, F minor 7, D7, to which we'll add the raised ninth, D flat, say a 6/9, C7 with a flat of 9, B7 with a flat 9, flat 5. Listen to this a little more closely now. B flat minor 7, G flat major 7, F minor 7, D7 raised 9, D flat 6/9, C7, let's say with a raised 5 and a lowered 9, B7 with a raised 9, and so forth. Put them together. Now, piano players can do a convenient thing in describing certain uses of chords. We can call them polychords and distribute them between the two hands. Say you have a D flat here, and you have an E flat upstairs. You can go up the whole scale that way. Nice effect as it is. So you can write this with a slash or a fraction sign. D flat on the bottom, E flat on the top. Another way is, say you have C on the bottom and E flat on the top. Again, gives you the raised 9 kind of chord. You can extend this kind of thinking to all sorts of ways, like suppose I hold down a B chord in the left hand, B triad. In the right hand I can put a D, then an F, then an A flat, all sorts of things. But if you keep them close enough together, they merge as one chord. Now, Evans had some characteristic ways of shaping phrases. Typically, he would do a 2-measure phrase, rather short. He was not one of the people who wanted to play extremely long phrases, like the Leonard Tristano folks, and a lot of others too. He would play short phrases. They would likely be somewhat incomplete, and they might start after the beat. He practiced the same principle that I've heard Miles Davis tell somebody one time. Never start on the beat, and don't have a definite ending either. It adds to the floating quality of Evans' playing. So suppose we do this. Poor Butterfly in 3/4 time with some of those changes, and these phrases. He used a great many triplets in his phrases, like this. Also, typically, he would be upstairs here in the soprano. Some pianists prefer to play down here. They want to sound, I think, more like a tenor sax. Like that. Evans, I think, was up here. I don't know what he wanted to sound like. What would you say, a flute, a violin? At any rate, this is where he seemed comfortable. And he'd put in these eighth notes which would propel. If he played a bunch of these short phrases together, then he would, so to speak, reward you with a long phrase after that, which is very good architectural thinking. Here's the reward. Another thing that he did, he used what's called a diminished scale. This goes like this. Let's descend with it. Whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone, whole tone, half tone. Going up, of course. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. It's very useful not only for diminished chords, which it's made to order for, but for chords of which the diminished is the top element. So suppose you have an F, and we'll call it an F7 with a lowered 9, and that means that the top of the chord is a diminished chord. Well, it works great with that. The fingering of this scale is something you have to find in more recent piano methods than the classical ones, because it never used to be considered a regular scale. It's not a minor, it's not the usual diatonic, but it's very useful, and jazz people know all about it. There are 3 of those scales because there are 3 diminished chords, and then you start over again. So there's this one, and that one, and this one. And it's worthwhile learning fingerings on each degree of the scale in all 3 of them. In all of these things, Evans was enormously influential. I think that almost every player since his time has studied his music, and we felt it in all sorts of contemporary players. But for me, the essential thing about Bill's playing is this plaintive quality. It's very plaintive, almost melancholy. Even when he swings hard, which he can do at times, it seems to want to come back to this loner, plaintive atmosphere. This is a good time to raise the matter of the book you see here called The Thesaurus of Scales and Melodic Patterns. It was compiled by a man named Nicholas Slonimsky, who lived until the age of 102, died in December 95, liked to refer to himself as the oldest Wunderkind. He had many achievements to his name, and one of the oddest was that he developed a whole system which mightily affected John Coltrane and people who listened to John Coltrane. And I'll show you what's inside this book. I'll give you just an example. Now, here are hundreds and hundreds of musical examples of permutations and repermutations and all kinds of inside-out permutations of the 12 tones of the musical scale. Let me show you one in particular. Over here, number 625 is one that I found useful, and it's just one of many that people use. And for example, can you hear John Coltrane doing? And there are various other, I mean, no point in trying to be anywhere near complete about this, but the point is that Coltrane started a new sort of musical thinking. This is not that it was so new that it hadn't been done by George Gershwin in the opening of Porgy and Bess, strangely enough, in the famous xylophone part, but Coltrane saw it as a way of tremendously increasing his vocabulary. And let me now move over to the piano person who took this vocabulary and developed it in his own extremely idiomatic manner into a vocabulary that he would use and that other pianists would begin to use also. McCoy Tyner, who began to play this way in the 1960s, is the gentleman. And from him, Chick Corea and a younger generation have established something which musicians refer to generally as pentatonics. Well, what this is, it's modal music, first of all. It doesn't go tonic to dominant. It doesn't do that. It wanders around in one mode or another for a long time. It's sort of altered state music, spiritual dimension. I once heard it called, this sort of music, and the ethnic music with which it is greatly related, called trance music. Anyhow, the point is, this music has an effect which increases the longer you do it. It gets into different dimensions of mental states. Characteristically, one way of doing this is the left hand plays the tonality, the basic modality, let's say, and chords in fourths on top of that, which wander around both inside that mode and outside it sometimes. The right hand comes right out of the Slonimsky book, John Coltrane, and it might go something like this. Sometimes it goes into what are called washes, like I've heard Chick Corea do these things occasionally, but of course he goes in many other directions. And the young players I have heard use this, like Jeff Keezer and Hal Galper and Bill Charlap and Ted Rosenthal, have the capacity to play in pentatonics as needed. That is to say, it's not the only thing they do, nor it is the only thing for which McCoy Tyner is known. He's also a very complete pianist, plays blues and standards. And this, like all other innovations, has become part of the general vocabulary of a working jazz pianist. A wash, which I mentioned before, is a pentatonic pattern that might be like this: B flat, E flat, F, A flat, in the modality of F, or say F minor. It might move up to B, E, F sharp, A. This music, as I said, gets its effect from its duration and its intensity, and it increases the more it goes on. I'll just do a little bit of it because I can't say I'm an expert at pentatonic music, but something like this.
Switch on that microphone on the mic. Where's the switch on the mic?